Elliot Briggs was the kind of man who believed that silence was a form of respect. Not the cold kind. Not the kind that builds walls. The kind you offer someone when you trust them enough to let them carry their own thoughts without filling every quiet moment with noise. For 19 years, that philosophy had worked. He and his wife, Corinne, had built their life on a foundation of easy silences and understood meanings. A look across the dinner table that said "long day, but I'm glad you're here." A hand rested briefly on a shoulder that said "I see you." Two people who had learned each other so well that words were often the least efficient way to communicate. And then, about 11 months ago, the silence changed. It was the same silence on the surface, the same absence of unnecessary words. But underneath it, something had shifted, a frequency that Elliot could feel but couldn't name. Like a tuning fork held close to your ear. Not quite a sound, just a vibration that told you something nearby was resonating at a frequency you weren't built to receive. Corinne Briggs, who had spent 22 years working as a physical therapist at Mercy Ridge Medical Center in Birmingham, Alabama, had always come home with something left over from her patients. Not their problems, she was careful about that, but a kind of warmth, a residue of having spent the day genuinely helping people move again after the world had knocked them flat. She used to walk through the back door and say the same thing almost every evening. Feet hurt, hearts full. That was Corinne, a woman who could hold difficulty without letting it hollow her out. She stopped saying it around last October. At first, Elliot told himself she was tired. She had picked up extra shifts when 2 colleagues went on extended leave, and the schedule had been brutal. He told himself that a woman who had given that much to that many people for that long was simply running dry, and that the right thing to do was give her space to refill. He gave her space. The space did not help. By December, she had stopped sitting beside him on the couch in the evenings. She would come home, eat whatever he had prepared. Elliot did most of the cooking, had since their daughter Bria left for college 3 years ago, and then disappear into the study with the door pulled almost shut. Not fully, just enough. He noticed everything. That was his particular burden. Elliot was an air traffic controller at Birmingham Shuttlesworth International Airport, a job that had trained him to register anomalies the way other people registered weather. You learn, in that line of work, to hold a full picture in your mind at all times, and notice the moment one element deviates from its expected trajectory. He had been doing that for 26 years. He could not turn it off at home. He noticed the way Corinne's phone was always face down now, the way she ended calls when he walked into the room, not abruptly. She was too careful for that, but naturally, with a sentence that could have been a legitimate ending to any conversation. He noticed the new cardigan she wore constantly, even in the warm rooms, buttoned high. He noticed the Tuesdays and Thursdays when she left 40 minutes earlier than her shift required and returned 40 minutes later than it should have ended. He built theories the way controllers build flight paths. Methodical, evidence-based, and every theory he built pointed in the same direction. By February, he had convinced himself that his wife of 19 years was in love with someone else. He did not confront her. That was also his training. You do not deviate from procedure until you are certain of what you're dealing with, because a wrong intervention in a crowded airspace doesn't just affect one plane. He waited. He watched. He grew quieter himself, which he recognized as ironic, and which he also could not stop. Their daughter called on a Sunday in March. Bria was 21, finishing her last semester at Auburn, warm and perceptive in the way that made Elliot privately convinced she had gotten the best of both of them. She asked, in the careful tone she reserved for things she'd been thinking about for a while, whether her parents were okay. Elliot said they were fine. He was not fine. By April, he had an appointment scheduled with a family law attorney named Gerald Hutchins, a man his colleague Devon had used 2 years prior. The appointment was on a Thursday at noon. He had not told anyone. He had not written it down anywhere that Corinne might find. He canceled it twice. He rescheduled it. He kept the third appointment. Gerald Hutchins was a careful man who asked careful questions and did not editorialize. Elliot laid out the facts the way he would lay out a traffic pattern for a junior controller. Methodically, without effect. When he finished, Hutchins said, "Before we move forward, I'd recommend one honest conversation, not because it's legally necessary, because you seem like a man who will need to know he tried." Elliot did not schedule the conversation. He drove home, sat in the parking garage beneath their building for 37 minutes, and then went upstairs. That was last Thursday. He planned to have the conversation that evening. He had rehearsed the opening sentence 11 times in the elevator. He knew exactly where he would sit, which lamp he would leave on, how he would begin. What he did not plan for was coming through the front door at 5:40 in the afternoon to find the apartment quiet, and Corinne's voice coming low and unsteady from the balcony off the bedroom. The door opened 2 inches, the late April light coming through orange and slanted. He stopped walking. Her voice was not the voice she used with him. It was not the voice she used with anyone he had ever heard her speak to. It was the voice underneath all the other voices, scraped thin, barely assembled. The voice of someone who had been holding a very heavy thing for a very long time and was finally, in what they believed to be private, allowing their hands to shake. "I'm so tired, Yvonne. I am so tired of being strong about this." Yvonne was her older sister in Memphis, the one Corinne called when something was too large to carry alone. "I know he suspects something. I can see it in how he looks at me. And I can't tell him. I cannot put this on him. You know what he's like. He'll restructure his entire life around my situation. He'll stop sleeping. He'll research every specialist in a 3-state radius. He'll carry it like it's his fault somehow." A breath. Uneven. "The oncologist says the second round should be the last one. I'm almost through it. I just need a few more weeks, and then I'll have the results, and then I'll tell him everything. I just need to get to the other side of this first." Oncologist. Elliot stood in his own hallway with his keys still in his hand. Second round. The word oncologist hit him the way certain altitude alarms hit. Not loud, but absolute. The kind that doesn't offer interpretation. The kind that simply tells you the situation has changed and everything else adjusts around that single fact. For a long moment, he did not move. Then slowly, he walked back to the front door, let himself out quietly, took the stairs instead of the elevator, sat down on a concrete step between the 4th and 5th floors with his back against the cold painted cinder block. He had spent 11 months building a case against his wife. His wife had spent 11 months fighting cancer alone so he wouldn't have to watch. If you've ever been certain about something, absolutely certain, and then had that certainty pulled out from under you in a single sentence, not replaced by something better, just removed. You know what Elliot felt on that stairwell. It isn't relief, not yet. It's something that doesn't have a clean name. The sudden weightlessness of a conviction that has been holding you upright, gone. He sat there until he heard the balcony door slide shut above him. Then he sat there a little longer. Let's step outside this story for a moment, because what just happened to Elliot has a name in psychological literature, and understanding it matters for understanding what comes next. What Elliot experienced over those 11 months is called attribution error under ambiguous loss, a specific pattern documented extensively in research on relational psychology. When a partner becomes emotionally unreachable and offers no explanation, the human mind does not tolerate the vacuum. It fills it. Almost always, it fills it with the worst available explanation. Not because people are cynical, but because our threat detection systems are calibrated to prepare for danger rather than hope for benign outcomes. The mind says, "I need a reason," and in the absence of the real reason, it constructs one from the evidence available. For Elliot, the evidence, the turned-down phone, the early departures, the closed door, the silence, pointed, as it would have pointed for almost anyone, toward betrayal. His mind built a coherent and entirely false story from a set of true facts. Every fact he observed was accurate. The story he told himself about those facts was completely wrong. This is not a failure of intelligence. Elliot is an exceptionally intelligent man. This is the predictable behavior of a mind denied information it needs. The mind responsible for maintaining the safety of dozens of aircraft at once had been given a critical unknown and had done exactly what it was trained to do: develop the most probable explanation and act accordingly. The tragedy is not that he was wrong. The tragedy is that Corinne never told him, and that she had reasons that made complete sense from inside her own fear, for staying silent. He went back upstairs after 40 minutes. Corinne was in the kitchen, her back to him, filling a glass of water. She had changed out of her work clothes. The new cardigan, he understood the cardigan now, was buttoned to the collar. He set his keys on the counter. She turned around, saw his face, and went still. There is a specific way a person goes still when they realize the thing they have been protecting has shifted. Not guilt exactly, not relief. Something closer to the moment before impact, when the body understands what is coming before the conscious mind has processed it fully. "I came home early," Elliot said. His voice was steady. He had years of practice keeping his voice steady under pressure. "I heard you on the balcony." Corinne set the glass down on the counter very carefully. The silence between them lasted about 4 seconds. Then she sat down on the kitchen floor, not dramatically, not a collapse. She simply sat down, the way a person sits when the standing has become too much, and pulled her knees to her chest and looked at the floor and began to cry in the quiet, exhausted way of someone who has been saving up tears for a very long time and has finally been given permission to let them out. Elliot sat down on the floor beside her. He did not say anything right away. He had spent 26 years knowing when to speak and when to hold frequency and wait. He waited. After a while, Corinne pressed the back of her hand to her mouth, steadied herself, and looked at him sidelong, the way she had looked at him on their first date when she was deciding whether or not to trust him with something real. "It started last June," she said. "I found a lump. I told myself it was nothing. I waited 6 weeks to get it looked at because I was scared of what they would say. And then they said it." She exhaled. "Stage 2, breast. They wanted to start treatment immediately." He asked her why she hadn't told him. She was quiet for a moment. "Because I know you," she said. "I know exactly what you would have done. You would have restructured everything. Taken the leave you've been saving for 7 years. Driven me to every appointment. Sat in every waiting room. Read every clinical study you could find. You would have turned your whole life into my illness. And I couldn't let you do that." A pause. "And I couldn't stand the thought of you looking at me like I might disappear. I'd rather you think I was cold than watch you be afraid for me." Before we go further, and there is more to this story, more than either of them knew that evening, let's understand what Corinne just described. What she articulated, without using the clinical term, is what family psychologists call the caregiver preemption response. It occurs most often in people who have a strong internal identity as a caregiver, someone who has spent their life being the capable one, the reliable one, the person others lean on. When that person receives a serious medical diagnosis, their first psychological instinct is not to lean on their partner. It is to protect their partner from having to witness their need. The logic, from inside it, feels like love. It feels like sacrifice. It feels like the most devoted thing they can do. What it actually does is sever the connection the relationship depends on. Corinne had spent 11 months trying to protect the marriage by removing herself from it. The very act of protection had become the source of the damage she was trying to prevent. This is not a character flaw. In people whose identity is built around caregiving, it is almost an automatic response, a reflex so deep it bypasses rational consideration. Corinne had given 30 patients a week her full presence for over 2 decades. She did not know how to receive care. She had never been taught that receiving was also a form of intimacy. Elliot looked at his wife on the kitchen floor, and he said the thing that had been true for 11 months. the thing he had buried under suspicion and procedure, and the controlled frequency voice he used when he needed to hold everything together. "I thought you'd stopped loving me." She looked at him with an expression that broke and reformed in the same moment. "I loved you so much," she said, "that I didn't want you to have to watch me be sick." He reached over and took her hand. They stayed on the kitchen floor for a long time. Now hold on, because there is a layer to this story that Elliot does not yet know. And when he finds it, it will ask more of him than anything the previous 11 months required. 2 days after that conversation on the kitchen floor, Elliot called his brother-in-law, Corinne's younger brother, a man named Perry, who lived 20 minutes away in Hoover, and who had, for the past 11 months, been the person Elliot had occasionally confided his suspicions to. Carefully, without specifics, just enough to have somewhere to put the weight. Perry picked up on the second ring. Elliot told him about the balcony, about the oncologist, about the conversation on the floor. There was a silence on the other end that lasted longer than it should have. "Perry," Elliot said, "talk to me." Another pause. Then, "There's something you need to know, and I need you to let me get through all of it before you say anything." It came out piece by piece. Perry had known since August. Corinne had called him the week she started her first round of chemotherapy because she had needed someone to drive her to the appointment. Elliot was on shift, and she hadn't wanted to call a car service and arrive alone. She had made Perry promise not to say anything. She had been specific about it. "He cannot know. Not yet. I'm handling it." Perry had agreed because she was his sister and she was frightened, and she had asked him with the particular voice that sisters use when they are asking for the one thing they need most. He had driven her to 4 appointments. He had picked up 2 prescription refills. He had held the secret for 8 months. Elliot sat with the phone against his ear and looked at the wall of the living room where a photograph had hung for 7 years. Himself, Corinne, Bria at 16, all 3 of them squinting into the sun on the deck of a rented cabin in the Smoky Mountains. He had always liked that photograph because everyone in it was genuinely, unposed happy. He looked at it for a long time. "Did anyone else know?" he asked. Perry hesitated. "Bria found out about 6 weeks ago," he said. "She didn't find out from me. She figured it out. You know how she is." Elliot did know how Bria was. He thanked Perry. He hung up. He sat in the chair across from that photograph until the light in the room changed. Then he called his daughter. Bria answered immediately, as she always did when he called. She was back in Birmingham for the week, staying in her old room while finishing a final paper remotely. She had not mentioned why she had come home early. She had simply appeared. He understood now why she had come home. She knew. When he asked her directly, she said yes. And then she said something that Elliot was not prepared for. "Dad," she said, very quietly. "I've been driving her too, for the last 5 weeks. I told her I was coming home for a visit. We just didn't tell you what we were doing while you were at work." His daughter. His 21-year-old daughter, finishing her last semester at college, had been quietly building her schedule around her mother's chemotherapy appointments, sitting in those waiting rooms, making sure Corinne did not have to do any of it alone, while Elliot sat in his apartment 11 floors up and constructed theories about phone logs. He had been the only person in his own family who did not know what his family was carrying. Here is where a third pattern in family psychology becomes relevant to this story, and it is perhaps the most quietly painful of all. Researchers who study families navigating serious illness have documented what is sometimes called the protective exclusion dynamic. It follows a consistent shape. When a member of a family system develops a crisis, they are afraid to share with their primary partner. They will typically recruit one trusted person to help bear the weight. But once one person is recruited, others discover the situation or are recruited themselves, and the circle quietly expands. The person being protected often ends up being the only one who does not know what everyone around them already knows. The people inside the circle do not think of themselves as keeping a secret. They think of themselves as honoring a wish, as being loyal, and in their individual actions, each of them is right. Perry drove his sister to chemotherapy because she needed a ride and she was scared. Bria came home from college because her mother was going through something hard and she wanted to be near her. None of these choices in isolation was wrong, but the cumulative effect. Elliot, at the center of this family, working to keep aircraft safe and strangers alive, and coming home every night to a version of his family that was being carefully managed around him, carried a specific kind of damage. Not because anyone intended harm, but because the experience of being the only one not trusted with the truth about the people you love most is its own particular wound. He did not go to Bria's room that night. He needed to understand the full shape of things before he spoke to anyone else. That was also his training. Assess the whole pattern before you make a single adjustment. He went instead to the kitchen, where Corinne was sitting at the table with a cup of tea she wasn't drinking, waiting for him to finish the phone calls she knew he was making. She looked up when he came in. She already knew what he'd found out. She could read it in the way he stood. "Bria came home for me," she said, before he could speak. "I didn't ask her to. She showed up, and I didn't send her away." "I know." "And Perry." "I know." A long pause. "I was the only one who didn't know," he said. Not accusatory, just stating a fact. Corinne closed her eyes. "I know," she said, and the way she said it, the weight in it, told him that she had known that too, and that it had been its own source of shame. Elliot sat down across from her. He reached across the table and turned her hand over, palm up, the way he had on their second date in 2005, when he was trying to explain something he didn't have words for yet, and had finally just taken her hand to say, "Whatever this is, I'm not afraid of it." "Tell me where you are," he said. "All of it. From the beginning. I want to know everything I missed," she told him. It took a long time. They were still at that kitchen table when Bria, hearing voices, padded down the hallway in bare feet and stood in the doorway with her arms wrapped around herself the way she had as a small child. When she sensed that something important was happening that she didn't fully understand. But this time, she was 21, and she understood all of it, and what she was feeling was not confusion. It was the careful, alert hope of a young woman who had been holding two separate fears at once and was watching them, finally, slowly, be set down. Elliot looked at his daughter in the doorway. "Come sit down," he said. She came and sat between them. There is a psychological concept that family therapists call the moment of re-entry. The point at which a family that has been operating in divided, protective subgroups finally comes back into full contact with itself. It does not announce itself dramatically. It does not look like a scene from a movie. It usually looks exactly like what it looked like in that kitchen in Birmingham. 3 people at a table at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, not saying very much, simply allowing themselves to be in the same room with the same truth at the same time. It is a small thing on the surface. It is not a small thing. In the days that followed, Elliot made adjustments. He was good at adjustments. It was, in many ways, the central skill of his professional life. The ability to take in new information and recalibrate without panic, without overcorrection, without making the solution worse than the problem. He did not take leave immediately. He and Corinne talked it through over 2 evenings, carefully, the way they used to talk through everything, and they agreed that routine was part of what was holding her steady. What she needed was not for him to stop the world. She'd been afraid of that, had been running from it for 11 months. What she needed was to stop carrying it alone. So he did not restructure everything. He restructured one thing at a time. He started driving her to the appointments. Not everyone. She still wanted Perry for some of them, and he understood that some parts of a person's experience belong to particular relationships, and that claiming all of it for himself would be another way of not listening. But he was there for the ones that mattered most. He sat in the waiting rooms, with his hands folded and his phone in his pocket and his full attention on the door she had gone through. And he did not research every specialist in a 3-state radius the way she had feared, though he did read enough to understand what she was facing. He learned to ask instead of assume. That was harder than it sounds for a man trained to assess situations from a distance and act on analysis. Asking, genuinely asking, not asking in order to already know the answer, required him to sit with uncertainty in a way that his professional instincts had spent decades training him to avoid. Corinne noticed the effort. She told him so one evening, in the car on the way home from her third-to-last treatment, when the streetlights were just coming on and she was leaning her head back against the headrest with her eyes half closed. "You're different," she said. "In what way? You're not managing me. You're just here." He kept his eyes on the road. "I was always here," he said. "I just didn't know where to put myself." She reached over and rested her hand on his forearm and left it there the rest of the drive home. They began meeting with a counselor named Dr. Wanda Osetutu, a family therapist who worked out of an office on Lakeshore Drive, and who had in the first session said something that both of them had been quietly turning over ever since. The silence between you was not evidence of indifference. It was evidence of two people trying very hard to protect something they both valued, in two entirely opposite directions. The goal now is not to eliminate the instinct to protect. It is to make sure you are both inside the protection, not on opposite sides of it. Elliot had written it down on the back of a parking receipt he found in his jacket pocket. He still had it. Bria went back to Auburn in mid-May to finish her final exams. Before she left, she sat with both her parents in the living room and said the things she had apparently been composing for some time, in the direct, organized way that made Elliot privately convinced she was going to be a better air traffic controller than he'd ever been if she ever wanted the job. "I need both of you to agree to something," she said. "I need you to agree that the next time something happens, anything, the first thing you do is tell each other. Before you protect me, before you protect anyone. Each other first." She looked at her father. "That means you too," she said. "If something happens to you, you tell her. You don't decide she can't handle it. You trust her to handle it." He agreed. Corinne agreed. Bria nodded, satisfied, and went to finish packing. The results from the final scan came on a Wednesday morning in early June. Elliot was not at work. He had arranged to take the morning off. Not the whole day, just the morning. Because Corinne had said she didn't want to make too large a thing of it in case the news was something they needed to handle calmly. He sat beside her on the couch with his phone in his hand and her phone on the cushion between them, and they waited for the call from Dr. Abrams' office. When it came, Corinne put it on speaker. The nurse said, "Ms. Briggs, I'm calling with results from your most recent imaging. Dr. Abrams wanted me to let you know. The scans are clear. The treatment was effective. We're not seeing any active disease." Corinne did not cry immediately. She pressed both hands flat against her thighs and looked straight ahead for a moment, the way a person looks when they've been braced for something for so long that the bracing doesn't release all at once. Then she turned to look at Elliot. He was already looking at her. She put her face against his shoulder and held on, and the sound she made was not quite crying. It was something more fundamental than that, something closer to the sound a structure makes when load-bearing tension is finally, after a very long time, released. He held her and did not say anything. There was nothing to say that was more important than just holding on. They called Bria together. She cried immediately, loudly, with the uncomplicated intensity of a 21-year-old who had not yet learned to compress her emotions into socially appropriate forms, and Elliot loved her for it. They called Perry. They called Yvonne in Memphis. Each call was short because there was only one thing to say, and once you had said it, the rest of the conversation was just people being happy together on the phone, which is its own good thing. That evening, all four of them, Elliot, Corinne, Bria, and Perry, who had driven over with a container of his wife's macaroni and cheese and a bottle of sparkling cider, sat around the kitchen table that had been the site of so many silent dinners over the past 11 months. The table was loud now. Perry was telling a story about the time he had lied to their mother about something inconsequential and gotten caught within 48 hours, and Corinne was laughing. A full, unguarded laugh, the kind Elliot had been afraid he might not hear again, and Bria was laughing so hard she had to set down her fork, and Elliot sat back in his chair and looked at the people around his kitchen table and understood what he had almost lost while it was sitting right in front of him. He had almost left this. He had scheduled the appointment. He had made the plan. He had, on at least 3 separate occasions, looked at his wife across a silent room and quietly decided that the foundation was beyond repair. The foundation had not been broken. The foundation had been carrying something he hadn't been allowed to see. Let's step back from this story one final time, because there is a principle at work in what happened here that goes beyond any single marriage or any single family. What Elliot and Corinne were caught inside, each of them protecting the other from the weight of a truth, each of them suffering alone out of love, each of them creating, through the very act of protection, the damage they were working to prevent, is what psychologists who study couples in medical crisis call the parallel silence pattern. It is one of the most reliably documented and reliably painful dynamics in long-term relationships. 2 people who love each other deeply arrive by different roads at the same decision. I will carry this alone so they don't have to. And that decision, made independently and simultaneously by 2 people who trust each other with everything except this, produces the exact outcome both of them were trying to prevent: distance, misreading, the slow erosion of the very foundation they were trying to hold up. The research on couples who survive serious illness without long-term relational damage consistently points to one variable above all others: not communication style, not conflict resolution technique, not even emotional intelligence. The single most protective factor is what researchers call disclosed vulnerability. The willingness, when the hardest thing arrives, to turn toward your partner and says, "I am scared, and I need you to know that." Not because it fixes anything, not because it makes the fear go away, but because it keeps the 2 people inside the same room with the same truth, which is the only place from which anything real can be built. Elliot and Corinne had learned that at considerable cost. They were not going back. On a Saturday evening in late July, when the Alabama summer had not yet released its grips and the light through the kitchen windows came in that particular thick gold that only exists in the South in July, Elliot Briggs stood in the backyard of the house where they had raised their daughter, and he watched his wife. She was talking to Perry's wife, Marlena, at the far end of the yard by the garden. Corinne had let go fallow during the past year, and had begun, in the last few weeks, to tend again. Her hands were moving the way they moved when she was happy and engaged. Her curls, she had worn them loose that afternoon, and Elliot had watched her in the bedroom mirror as she'd done so, deliberately, without comment, and understood what it meant, were catching the late light. She glanced over and saw him looking at her. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she smiled at him. The specific, small, private smile that had nothing to do with the people around her and everything to do with him. He smiled back. Later that evening, when the yard had emptied and the dishes were done and the house was quiet, they sat side by side on the back step in the dark, the way they had when Bria was small and they'd needed a few feet of grown-up silence after bedtime. The fireflies were out. It was the kind of Alabama evening that makes you understand why people stay. "I want to ask you something," Corinne said. "Go ahead. If you had filed, if you had actually gone through with it, do you think we would have been the kind of people who figured it out eventually? Or do you think we would have just let it go?" Elliot considered the question carefully. He did not give answers before he had actually considered the question. "I think," he said finally, "that I would have regretted it for the rest of my life, and I think, at some point, I would have needed to know why, and eventually I would have found out, and it would have been too late, And I would have known that, and I would have had to live with that. Corinne was quiet for a moment. I think I would have, she said. Let it go. I think I would have told myself it was the right thing, that I was releasing you from something hard, and I would have believed it. And I would have been so wrong. The fireflies moved through the dark yard. Something small moved in the garden. Corinne was tending back to life. Don't do that again, Elliot said. I won't. Either of us. Either of us. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they stayed there long after the night had deepened, and the yard had gone still, and the only light was the soft spill from the kitchen window behind them. There are marriages that survive crisis by becoming what they were before, patched back into their original shape, the seams carefully hidden. And there are marriages that survive by becoming something different. Not repaired to what was, but rebuilt into what couldn't have existed without the breaking. What Elliot and Corinne were building in those quiet months after the hardest year was the second kind. Something made not in spite of the silence and the fear and the 11 months of misunderstanding, but somehow, improbably, partly out of them. The way some alloys are stronger at the exact point where they've been subjected to the most pressure. They were still learning each other. After 19 years, they were genuinely, humbly still learning. That, Elliot would eventually decide, was the only foundation worth standing on. 3 weeks later, on a Wednesday evening, he came home from a long shift and set his jacket over the back of the kitchen chair. Corinne was at the counter, and she did not turn around when he came in, but she said, without pausing what she was doing, Bria called. She got the job in Atlanta. She starts in September. The one she wanted? The one she wanted. Elliot stood in his kitchen in the warm evening light. Good, he said. Corinne turned around. She was holding a wooden spoon and she was already smiling. She said, feet hurt, heart's full. And just like that, like a frequency returning after a long and frightening silence, something that had been missing for 11 months came back into the room. Not loudly, not all at once, simply returned the way good things sometimes do, quietly, when you have finally stopped being afraid to let them.